The heat in San Lucas felt like lead on the rusty roofs and dry land. The town smelled of warm earth, toasted corn, and routine. Amidst that dusty calm was a small workshop sandwiched between a grocery store and a quiet butcher shop. Samuel spent his days there, a man with a sunburned face, oil-stained hands, and eyes that seemed to ask permission before looking. He didn't talk much. He tightened nuts, welded parts, listened to engines as if listening to confessions. No one asked him about his history. No one expected him at parties or called him by nicknames. To everyone, he was simply the boy from the workshop, even though he was already over 30. That Monday, while the town seemed to sleep under the hum of old fans, laughter erupted on the main street. Rebecca got out of a late-model pickup truck wearing a wide-brimmed hat and boots stained with good soil, the kind that produces crops. Her father, Don Heriberto, was the man who owned the most land in the region and also the one who inspired the most respect. Rebecca did not seem to carry that weight. She was free, insolent, with the clear gaze of someone who had never been contradicted. She walked among the market stalls until her eyes fell on Samuel, who was bent over under a hood with his back wet with sweat. "You're the one who fixes broken things?" she asked without greeting him. Samuel looked up slowly. He blinked uncomfortably. "If it can be fixed, I'll try." She smiled, a sharp, almost amused smile. "My dad says that old Ford tractor is useless. The one in the old warehouse, the one even the engineers couldn't revive. Are you up for it?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He knew exactly what that machine was. A rusty monster, buried in cobwebs and disappointment. "What if I start it up?" he asked without sarcasm. Rebecca shrugged, feigning indifference. "If you start it today, we'll get married tomorrow," she said with a laugh that infected two nearby salesmen. Samuel didn't laugh. He just looked down and went back to his tools, but something in his hands began to tremble, as if he no longer cared about the engine he was repairing. That night, as the sun sank behind the hills on the horizon, Samuel walked alone to the abandoned warehouse at the back of Don Heriberto's property. He carried his toolbox, a flashlight, and something else, the gaze of all those who had seen him as invisible, now fixed on his back. And although no one knew it yet, that old sound of broken gears was about to echo throughout San Lucas. The warehouse was a tomb of forgotten metal. The air smelled of rust, old dampness, and loneliness. The only sounds were the crickets and the crunch of dry leaves under Samuel's boots. In front of him, covered in cobwebs and dust, was the old Ford 5000 tractor. A faded blue beast with wheels burst by time and an engine covered in layers of resignation. Samuel turned on his flashlight and approached slowly, as if the tractor might wake up violently. He ran his hand over the hood, feeling the scars on the metal. No one had touched that machine in almost 2 decades. They said it had once been used to harvest all of Don Heriberto's corn before breaking down during a storm. Since then, it had been nothing more than a big, sad memory. He took an old notebook out of his backpack. It had no plans, no diagrams, no new parts, just his notes, made with patience and memory. Hand-drawn sketches, calculations that no one had formally taught him. No one knew, but Samuel understood machines as others understand their children, through sounds, silences, vibrations. As he dismantled the carcass, the silence of the village seemed to watch him from afar. There were no witnesses, but something in him felt that they were watching him that night, not with their eyes, but with judgment. At the ranch, Rebecca was drinking tequila with her friends on the terrace. They laughed as they recounted how the village mechanic had taken the joke seriously. "Can you imagine if he succeeds?" one of them said between laughs. Rebecca raised an amused eyebrow. "Then I'll marry him and make him my gardener. After all, my life could use a little sunshine." But beneath her mockery, there was a slight tremor, a nervousness, a tiny, annoying doubt, like a splinter under her fingernail. Because even though she would never admit it, there was something about the way Samuel looked at her, calm and fearless, that had stayed with her. In the barn, Samuel worked tirelessly. The parts didn't fit, the spark plugs were rotten, and the wires looked like broken ribs, but his hands didn't tremble. Each screw he removed seemed to bring him closer not only to the engine, but to himself. As if, with each gear revealed, he also unearthed a forgotten fragment of his own history. When the clock struck 3 a.m. at 3 a.m., the tractor was still dead, but something had changed, not in the machine, but in Samuel, because for the first time in many years, he was willing to try something that could fail in front of everyone. And that risk, more than any joke or promise, was already transforming him. Dawn arrived uninvited, tinging the edges of the sky orange and revealing the dust suspended in the light. Samuel was still in the warehouse. His fingernails were black, his fingers swollen, and his shirt stuck to his body with dried sweat. He hadn't slept, he hadn't eaten, he had only worked in silence with a determination that even he didn't recognize in himself. The engine was no longer just a machine, it was a mirror. Outside, the ranch workers began to arrive. Some looked at him out of the corner of their eyes, curious, murmuring among themselves. The story had already spread like wildfire. The mechanic wants to revive the old Ford because Rebecca promised him as a joke. Some laughed, others felt sorry for him. No one believed he would succeed. No one except a silent figure who had approached without making a sound. Doña Martina, the ranch cook for 40 years, watched him from the doorway with her arms crossed. She had raised Rebecca like a second mother, but she also knew the gestures of the town, the way certain jokes were more than just a joke. "Young man," she said softly, "why are you lending yourself to this?" Samuel didn't look up, continuing to adjust a corroded valve. "Because she asked me to," he replied in a hoarse voice, "and because no one expects me to do it." Martina sighed, feeling a pang of sadness she couldn't explain. She left a thermos of hot coffee on the threshold and left without saying another word. By 11 a.m., the tractor seemed complete. The broken parts had been replaced with ingenuity, recycled parts, a little welding, and a lot of intuition. Samuel climbed into the seat with his hands covered in grease, trembling slightly. He turned the key carefully and the engine made a hollow sound, then another and then silence. A second attempt. Nothing. A third, and the engine roared. It coughed. It spewed thick smoke and vibrated like an old animal waking up from a long nightmare. The tractor was alive. The workers who were nearby stopped. Some of them approached. One of them let out a nervous laugh. "It can't be." Samuel climbed down from the seat. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his arms. He just breathed as if he could finally do so after years of tightness in his chest. That metallic roar was not just the triumph of a repair. It was a cry, a claim, an affirmation. And yet, when Rebecca arrived, riding her white horse and surrounded by friends, she didn't applaud. She just looked at him from afar, with a mixture of surprise and something else that was harder to read. Then Samuel said in a low but firm voice. Rebecca dismounted elegantly, walked towards the tractor, slowly circled it, touched the still warm hood, and smiled with the same irony as the day before. "I only said that if you started it today, we'd get married tomorrow." She got back on her horse, tipped her hat, and rode away, leaving behind a brief laugh, sharp as a knife. Samuel didn't respond, but something in his eyes dimmed. For days, the town talked about one thing: the mechanic who started the impossible. The story, initially a source of ridicule, began to change tone. The ranch workers began to visit the workshop with silent respect. They left him parts, tools, food. No one said much, but everyone knew that Samuel had done something that even the engineers in the capital had failed to achieve. Don Heriberto, however, didn't say a word, and Rebecca disappeared. She didn't return to the workshop, didn't ask about the tractor, didn't cross paths with Samuel anymore. He continued working, but something in his posture had changed. He walked more upright, greeted people with his eyes raised, and for the first time in a long time, people responded to him. One afternoon, the village school called the workshop. The only truck that transported the children had been out of service for weeks, and no one had been able to fix it. Samuel went without charging, crawled under the vehicle, and in less than 2 hours, he had it roaring. When the engine started, the children applauded as if he had performed magic. A mother approached him and put her hand on his shoulder. "Thank you. Not for the truck, but for what you are doing for this town." That night, Samuel had dinner with his mother in silence. She, sick and almost always absent in her thoughts, looked up clearly for the first time in months. "I saw you in the square," she murmured with a soft smile. "They greeted you as if you were someone important." Samuel didn't know what to say. He just looked down with shining eyes. Days later, Rebecca returned. She appeared at the workshop door just before sunset with her hair down and no hat. She wore a simple dress, nothing like her usual heiress uniform. "I owe you an apology," she said bluntly. "I shouldn't have played with that." Samuel looked at her silently. He was covered in grease but made no attempt to clean himself up. "It wasn't a game for me." She nodded. She looked down for the first time without arrogance. "I know. And maybe that's why I came back." There was a long, dense silence, the kind that seems to have a life of its own. "Do you want to go for a walk?" she finally asked. That afternoon, they walked along the edge of the dry river where the wind blew strongly and the leaves danced aimlessly. They spoke little. Rebecca asked him about his mother, his childhood, why he didn't leave town like the others. "Someone had to stay," he replied. She didn't laugh again, and when the sun set completely, she touched his hand. It wasn't a romantic or playful gesture. It was a small, human caress that Samuel found more valuable than any promise. For a week, Rebecca returned every day, sometimes to help in the workshop, sometimes just to watch. And although no one said anything, the villagers' attitudes began to change. Many thought that perhaps, after all, the story was not a joke, that perhaps that absurd promise was becoming something real. Even Samuel began to believe it, but what he didn't know was that all of this, the visits, the tenderness, the gestures, was part of the edge of a precipice, and he was about to fall. The following Sunday, the town celebrated the annual San Lucas Fair. The streets were decorated with confetti, children ran around with balloons in their hands, and vendors offered corn on the cob, fritters, and cold drinks. The atmosphere smelled of celebration, of family, of a temporary truce in a difficult life. Samuel didn't usually go. He was never part of the hustle and bustle. But that year, something inside him pushed him to put on his best iron shirt, comb his hair carefully, and walk to the square. Maybe it was because of Rebecca. She had invited him the afternoon before with a smile that didn't seem to have a double meaning. "I want you to be there with me," she said. No longer as a mechanic, but as you, and those words, so simple, so dangerous, stuck with him like a promise. The square was full. Samuel walked among the people, feeling for the first time that the greetings were sincere. Some men offered him beer. The women looked at him with respect, as if he had finally been admitted to an invisible club from which he had always been excluded. When he reached the central square, he saw Rebecca. She was stunning, wearing a light blue dress that made her look otherworldly. She was smiling, but her smile was not for him. She was holding hands with Alvaro, the mayor's son. The scene was quick but brutal. Alvaro put his arm around her waist, whispered something in her ear, and she let out a laugh identical to the one on the first day. Then she saw him. Rebecca looked directly at him. For a moment, it seemed as if something inside her broke, but she didn't let go of Alvaro's hand, nor did she approach him or explain anything. She just looked at him. And then, as if the story didn't belong to them, she turned her face away and continued talking to the crowd. Samuel said nothing. He stood there, among the sweet smells and bright colors, feeling as if everything he had believed he had built was quietly falling apart, like an engine that had its soul taken away, just as it was starting to run. Some people in the square also saw it, noticed it, but no one approached. He walked back alone, his hands empty, and his chest filled with more silence than ever. That night, he didn't sleep. At dawn, he dismantled the tractor piece by piece without anger, with painful precision, as if he needed to erase all traces of that story, as if each screw returned to its box were a way of recovering something of himself that he should never have given away. At the Heriberto's house, Rebecca cried, not in front of anyone, alone in her room, her face in her hands. She knew she had betrayed him, not out of love, but out of fear, fear of what they would say, of what she would lose, of crossing a line that her family would never allow her to cross. But that fear was no excuse, and she knew it, only now it was too late. San Lucas returned to its slow pace after the fair. The laughter died down, the decorations were taken down, and the town returned to its gray days. But something was different. Samuel was no longer in his workshop. The doors had been closed since Monday. No one had seen him leave, not at the store, not at church, not even at the hospital where he used to buy his mother's medicine. Some said he had left, others that he was ill, but no one dared to knock on the door. Only one person did. Martina, the old cook, arrived with a bowl of broth and eyes full of questions. She didn't need to knock. The door was ajar. Inside, the workshop was empty, clean, without a single tool, as if it had never existed. On the table was a handwritten letter. Martina didn't open it, but she took it with her. Hours later, the square filled up again. Rebecca, her face tense and without makeup, climbed onto the Costco and asked for silence. No one understood what she was going to say. Many still remembered her laughing with Alvaro. With a trembling voice, she held up Samuel's letter. Her hands were sweating. She swallowed. "I'm going to read something he wrote before he left, because I think you and I need to know who he really was." She opened the sheet of paper. Her voice broke at times, but she continued. "No one cared much when I arrived in this town. I was just a teenager with a sick woman in tow, and a silence that weighed more than a suitcase. I came from Chihuahua after my father abandoned us. I was 15 years old, and I learned to fix things not because I wanted to, but because there was no one else to do it. At 17, I built an irrigation system out of old motorcycle parts so my mother could plant in the yard. It worked for 5 years. No one knew. When I repaired the first school bus, I did it because I saw the children walking 5 kilometers under the sun, and because I remembered what it was like to be late because I had no way to get back. I never wanted to be a hero, a mechanic, or a martyr. I just wanted to exist without being looked at as if I were in the way. The tractor wasn't for her or for the town. It was for me, because I also needed to believe that it was still possible to move something that had been dead for so long. I'm sorry if I disappointed anyone, but more than anything, I forgive myself for having believed, even for a moment, that someone like me could be chosen." The silence in the square was absolute, not because of a lack of noise, but because of an excess of truth. The next day, Martina went to see Don Heriberto. She entered without asking permission, as she had done for 40 years. "That boy fixed more than a tractor," she said firmly, "and you didn't even see it." She left an old, worn folder on the desk, but it contained official papers, plans, photographs, inventions signed by Samuel, presented years ago at agricultural technology fairs, and never recognized by anyone because they had no academic stamp or important surname. Don Heriberto said nothing, but he couldn't hold her gaze. That night, Rebecca went to the workshop. It was empty, but not abandoned. On the wall, hanging from a crooked nail, was a single object: Samuel's sketchbook. She opened it with trembling hands, and there, among engine diagrams and formulas written in pencil, she found a different page. A portrait. Hers, drawn with precision, with tenderness, as only someone who has truly looked can draw. Rebecca sat on the floor with the sketchbook on her lap, and for the first time cried without hiding. Samuel's absence became a visible burden on the village. The closed workshop was like an uncovered wound. He was no longer the mechanic. Now everyone knew his name, his story, his value. But it was too late. And St. Luke, who was always late for everything, was also late for him. At school, the truck broke down again, but this time no one could fix it. The principal asked for help from the capital. It took weeks. The mothers began walking with their children in the early morning. At Don Heriberto's ranch, the machinery came to a standstill. The Ford tractor that Samuel had brought back to life was dismantled piece by piece on Don Heriberto's orders, as if that could erase the shame of having been surpassed by a man who had never studied at university. But the workers refused to touch it. They said that tractor was no longer just any machine. It was a symbol of something greater, and they left it there covered with a blue tarp as if waiting for its return. Meanwhile, Rebecca stopped attending social events. She distanced herself from Alvaro without explanation, and soon rumors began to swirl around her, that she was ill, that she had gone crazy over a mechanic, that she had lost her place. Perhaps it was true, but not in the way they said, because something had indeed broken inside her, her comfort, her perfect world, her supposed superiority. All of that crumbled in the face of Samuel's truth. One day she plucked up her courage and went to the next town, to the small bus station. This young man came through here, tall, thin, dark, with a green backpack. she asked the manager. The man thought for a few seconds and nodded. Yes, a few days ago he took the bus to Guadalajara. He didn't seem to know exactly where he was going, but he said goodbye as if he didn't plan to return. Rebecca looked down. Something in her chest closed with a thud. She had lost him, but more than that, she had pushed him away. That night in the ranch kitchen, Martina served 2 cups of coffee. She sat down opposite Rebecca as she had when she was a child and spoke bluntly. Yours was not cowardice, it was habit. You were taught not to look down, but he was never down. He was just where you didn't dare to look. Rebecca didn't answer. She just hugged her for the first time in years and let the tears fall without explanation. The next morning, Rebecca did something no one expected. Dressed in boots, work pants, and her hair tied back, she opened Samuel's workshop. She cleaned it thoroughly, put the tools back in their place, and hung a handmade sign at the entrance. Samuel's workshop, reviving what everyone thought was dead. The first to arrive were the children, then the mothers, and later the men who had looked down on him. Rebecca didn't know anything about engines, but she knew about debt and redemption, and she was willing to learn. That same day, the old tractor was brought to the workshop. They all pushed it in as a promise that should not remain buried. San Lucas was finally waking up, but one thing was missing. Just one. 3 weeks passed and the workshop was still open. Rebecca, her hands stained with grease and her face without makeup, did her best to help. She had learned to change spark plugs, detect leaks, and clean carburetors, not out of pride or to prove anything, but out of respect, because that place was not hers, it was his. And even though she waited for him every day, she never talked about it, not even with Martina, who watched her silently from the shadows of the kitchen. One Friday afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the hills, a dusty bus stopped on the road that runs along San Lucas. No one saw it arrive. No one knew who got off. But minutes later, a boy ran through the square shouting, "Mr. Samuel is here, he's back." The news spread through the village like wildfire. Samuel walked down Main Street with the same green backpack, his face thinner, his beard grown out, and his eyes serene. No one dared to speak to him right away. They looked at him with a mixture of guilt, admiration, and relief until Doña Martina intercepted him bluntly, as always. "And what are you looking for?" Samuel smiled slightly. "I don't know, but I left something unfinished." When he arrived at the workshop, he found it different, cleaner, more alive, and her with her back to him, checking a toolbox. "Rebecca," he said in a low voice, as if naming her were still risky. She turned around, didn't cry, didn't talk about what had happened, just approached him slowly with the same expression she had that day at the dry river, when she touched his hand without promises. "I didn't come to ask you to come back," he said. "I came to give you back what is yours." Samuel looked at her and for the first time understood that his place did not depend on the workshop, or the tractor, or even recognition. His place was in what he had caused, in the way he had changed the way an entire town looked at things. He approached the tractor, caressed it like an old friend, and turned the key. The engine responded instantly, loud and alive, as if it had never been gone. In the days that followed, Samuel resumed his work, but not as before. He was no longer the village mechanic. He was Samuel, the one who understood engines and also people, the one who taught, the one who listened, the one who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Rebecca remained by his side, not as a broken promise, but as a new woman. And although there was never a wedding, no white dress, no ring, there was something stronger. A community that finally understood that courage does not always make noise, and a man who finally knew that being seen is not as important as being recognized.